generally, we believe that this is probably the highest impact initiative that a grocer can make, right? Because again, 25% waste reduction also means 25% cost reduction, right, for the grocers in their fresh departments. And that impact is just really huge on their bottom line.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the CleanTechies Podcast. This is episode 62 of the show. I'm your host, Silas Maynor, and I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to bring this show to you, and I'm very thankful to you for tuning in and for your support of the show. As always, if you are interested in being a sponsor, please reach out to me. You can reach out directly via my email, which is in the description. If this is your first time visiting with us and listening, please do subscribe, turn on notifications, and if you enjoy the show, we would appreciate a review to help us spread the word. And if you're a founder in the space, you can feel free to reach out. If you're looking to get word out about your company, potentially seeking funding, looking for talent, or potential introductions, in any way, we are glad to help with anyone we might know. So feel free to reach out. We're always glad to chat. And with that, let's get into the episode details. In today's episode, we're discussing what Afresh is doing to help reduce food waste at the grocer level with Johannes. And Afresh is basically, in summary, Afresh is an inventory software that helps grocers eliminate over-ordering. It helps predict demand, save grocers money, and ultimately reduce food waste. So kind of the main talking points that we go over today in this discussion are how Afresh is helping grocers manage their fresh food inventory in particular, as fresh food has kind of a number of other challenges that more food with longer shelf life does not. We also talk about the impacts of their technology as a whole on those companies. And then we talk about a little bit about the green edge, I guess you could call it, of being a sustainable grocer. And then we kind of touched a little bit on the regulatory landscape of the space as well. So generally speaking, really interesting episode with Johannes. And I guess, again, always before we get into the show, we do want to make special thanks to our sponsors, Next Wave Partners. Next Wave are experts in talent acquisition, recruitment, and retention across the climate tech, renewables, and ESG spaces globally. So if your team is growing or you're looking to make a career change, you can reach out to Next Wave at next-wavepartners.com or reach out to one of their consultants directly via their LinkedIn page. I think, again, Next Wave can help with a lot of different specialty searches within the climate tech and in ESG space globally. So if you have specific needs that are very difficult to fill, maybe consider reaching out to them. So without any further delay, let's get into the show.
All right. Welcome to the show, Johannes. How are you doing today?
Hey, good. How are you, Silas?
I'm good. I'm excited to have you on. And I guess, why don't we just get straight into it with why don't you introduce yourself to the audience, a little bit about what you do and kind of what you're currently doing right now as a kind of the summary, and maybe some of your kind of key accomplishments that you'd want to share as well.
Cool. Yeah, happy to, and super excited to be on the show. So my name is Johannes, originally born and raised in Germany. I am the head of BizOps at Afresh, and we're building technology for grocers. And obviously we'll talk a lot about how we're doing that and why we're doing it and what the impact of that is. I had a bit of an unconventional career path, did a bunch of work in the developing world, both in Rwanda, in East Africa, and in Asia, in the Himalayas, in Bhutan, and building hazelnut and mushroom industries, respectively. So that was sort of my first foray, both into sort of broader impact world, but also climate in particular in Bhutan, given we were planting 10 million trees, helping farmers, create income in their rural communities, and especially in a country that's sort of super vulnerable to the impact of climate change, right, on the foothills of the Himalayas that are obviously melting away like so much else in the world. And so then came to the US 5 years ago and joined Afresh about 3.5 or so years ago. Been growing with the company from 10 employees to 170, and super excited to chat about all of that.
I'm really curious, how did your early career experiences with working in the developing countries, I guess two questions on that. How did you first of all decide to do that, and how did that come about? And then how did that affect and kind of shape your career going forward?
Yeah. So I studied business in undergrad, and most business students, I did the typical internships, right? Consulting with a large corporation, and I just didn't feel like that was particularly meaningful, and I wanted to do something really impactful and meaningful early on, and just had this opportunity come up to go to Rwanda through, got connected through a friend, and that was sort of a little bit like I drank the Kool-Aid of the impact world and doing something more meaningful, and now I cannot really imagine doing something else, right? So the way it's shaping my view in the world and what I want to do and where I want to spend my time today is really mostly through that lens, right? I want to continue to work on the biggest problems that we face as humans, as a planet, and for me, that's climate change, and that's why we're chatting today, right?
Yeah, I'm also curious, since you've been in the space for a bit, what have you seen kind of change, especially over the past 5 or 6 years, in the space in general, with the way people look at impact? Because I know that it seems like kind of a high in the sky thing from what I understand when I first kind of came into the industry and in recruitment. So I'm just kind of curious to see what you've perceived the transformation to be, especially over the past 5 or 6 years.
Yeah, I think the main thing is that it's more and more a very viable career for more and more people, which is awesome, right? I have more and more friends who are taking it as a path, at business school, where I was a few years ago. It's becoming more and more of a thing that people talk about, people care about, and people want to do. And I think, coming out of undergrad, I was sort of the big outlier, right? The one person that was going into this space. And, obviously I did sort of kind of really out of the box things, right? But I didn't have anyone, right, who was going into climate or impact as a space. And coming out of grad school, there were a lot of people that are doing that, right? And increasingly, I think that's the case, right? And then I think just the second thing is public perception has really changed, right? I think there's a lot more awareness, and totally recognizing that I might be have a little bit of selective perception here, right? Given that I'm in that world. But it does feel like my day-to-day conversations with people who are not working in the world evolve more and more around that, right? Whether that's friends, family, acquaintances I meet, right? People start to care a lot more, which is exactly what we need.
Yeah, that is interesting. I think it would be, especially if you're starting to see that kind of what we would call regular people are not necessarily in the industry, having intelligent conversations about it. That means obviously it's getting around. So that's keen. That's interesting to see. Why don't we talk a little bit now? Just walk us through the company. So talk to us about the kind of the evolution and the story of the company. How did it come to be? And you can walk us all the way through up to what you're doing.
Totally. Yeah. So Afresh was founded by Matt and Nathan in 2017. Both attended Stanford Business School together, and while co-founding, really spent a ton of time in grocery stores and just in the food supply chain generally as a space. And the observation they had was that essentially there's two major dynamics at play. One is that there's an increased focus on fresh as a category within grocery, but really food broadly speaking, right? People want to eat more healthy, nutritionally dense food categories. They don't want to eat all this processed stuff, right? That has been advertised and marketed at them for so long. And there's tangible sort of there's tangible evidence for that, right? So Whole Foods being acquired by Amazon is a big example for that, right? Walmart and Target as big players that really cater to mass markets, right? Putting fresh food sort of really in the front of their store. All of that are sort of big signs that fresh is really the future and how grocers are differentiating each other, right, between each other. And then the second observation that the two of them had was that a lot of the technology, and really pretty much all of the technology that's built for these grocers, right, was built for the center of the store categories, right? Your boxes of Cheerios and cans of Coke, things that have a barcode, don't really expire, they're not seasonal, right? And if you apply that same technology to the fresh categories, your apples and avocados and prime ribs, it just doesn't work, right? It breaks down, it can't handle the seasonality, the perishability, all of that, right? And so the company is really founded with that as a major belief. Let's take cutting edge technology, really sort of advanced AI and ML models, right, and apply them to this specific problem, right? Let's help grocers and then at the food supply chain at large manage how stuff moves through the supply chain as quickly as possible from farm to consumer, so that we're wasting as little as possible throughout that process, right?
Mhm.
So that's sort of the initial premise of the company.
Could you talk to us a little bit more, maybe get into the process? Because obviously supply chain is something that's been talked about a lot recently with some of the global issues going on. But I think it's always interesting to take these ideas and take them into compartmentalized items. So could you maybe walk us through some of the aspects of how this actually works and break down and make a very clear distinctions between the different parts? And then if we can compare the conventional ways to the new way that you're doing now.
Yeah, totally. And I'll maybe paint a little bit of a picture of what the current status is in grocers in the US and really globally today, right? And very specifically, the thing we are touching at the moment is what goes between a distribution center of a grocer and the store of a grocer, right? So your Safeway or whichever grocer it is, right, that you go and do your shopping in, right? So there's a store level employee, and let's use the produce department as an example, right? Fruits and vegetables. So first category as you walk into the store, right? There's a store level employee that every day has to make a decision for hundreds of items in their category. How much of each item do I want to order from my distribution center, right? So it's really a pull system, right? The store says, I want 10 cases of bananas and 7 cases of avocados and 8 cases of Fuji apples, and so on and so on, right? And so that decision right now really relies on experience, on gut feeling, of intuition of these store level employees, right? And it's incredibly hard, right? I've seen this. They need to make 1,000 decisions in about 2.5 hours of process, and do that every single day in an ever-changing environment, right? And that's hard for someone who's done this for decades, which a lot of these store level employees have been in the store for a long time. But there's also a lot of turnover, right? With these kinds of jobs, right? And so it's particularly hard for folks who come in new and don't really know quite yet what is the demand for a given item, and obviously that changes all the time, right? And during COVID, sort of early days of COVID, right, that was a particularly great example for how unpredictable demand can be, right? So that's right now purely reliant on gut experience, intuition, right? We are essentially introducing machine learning algorithms into all of that, right? Both from forecasting how much inventory we believe the grocer has at any given time, to forecasting how much we think the demand will be for a given item at any given day. And then using those 2 data points and a little bit of input from the store level employee and making the best decision. And ultimately, what we're optimizing for it is we always want the sales floor of the store to be full, and we want the back room to be empty, right? That's sort of the perfect order and kind of the holy grail of what we're optimizing around.
Interesting. That is a fascinating thing. I've often thought about grocers and the fact that these are probably relatively difficult jobs sometimes, like in terms of what has to be done. And maybe you could look at it as a simple job, but probably the managers and the owners of the stores are the ones doing this often, I would assume, in some cases, because they don't have the employees to do it, and lower wage jobs. But that's interesting. So I guess one thing I'd be keen to understand is, so it sounds like, to just clarify, one of the questions I have, we can just clarify, no need to dwell on it, is that the customers are the grocery stores that are looking to improve their supply chain for fresh goods. The other thing I'm curious about is, how does implementation and setup look?
Yeah, so you're just confirming that. So the customers are grocers, and specifically, we deal with entire chains, right? So we wouldn't go to a single store and say, here's our solution. We would go to the headquarters and say, hey, we have this great solution. You should deploy this across all your stores, right? And that's kind of how we're approaching it with all of our partners. And then, sorry, do you mind repeating the second question?
Yeah, certainly. We're just kind of curious to understand what does the implementation and setup of this process look like. Usually, people are going to be disinclined to do something that's very difficult. So I'm assuming you have worked this out to make it a little bit smoother.
Yeah. So it's really relatively simple, right? Like we do a one-time integration sort of with the central database of the grocer, and we pull data like pricing and the order numbers and sales data and shipments data and all of that. So we pull that data, we understand that, we use that to feed our forecasting models and so on. So that's sort of the one-time integration with the central headquarters of the grocer. And then on a store level, our solution is essentially an iPad app, right? So, and it's really intentionally designed to mimic the current workflow that they're used to, right? So again, current workflow, they use like pen and paper and sort of almost a printed out Excel sheet, right? And as much as possible, we mimic that, right? So it's really easy in adoption, right? We're doing a very lightweight training as we're rolling out with different stores, but it's really, really easy. One of the funnest anecdotes I have from my early days at Afresh, as I was still going to the stores and helping to roll out our solution, was there was an employee at a store that had never used a smartphone, right? He sort of had a flip phone, like a Motorola flip phone, had never used an iPad, never used an iPhone, anything like that. And he was really scared, right? And this person, so we trained him, and it took maybe 2 or 3 hours, sort of on the longer end, I'd say, of what we're doing in terms of training. And he's now one of the biggest advocates for our app, right? And has been sort of going to other stores, telling this exact story. And it just, I think, really shows that, we're very intentional in how we designed the product, and trying to make it as absolutely easy as possible for our users.
Yeah, that sounds good. That was actually going to be my next question is the interface and getting used to for other things because I think that there's a lot of I'm always fascinated by the adoption of new technologies and how to get everybody on board because we obviously have mobile pay still nowadays, but there's still a lot of people who still write checks and do and pay kind of the old way, and I just find it very fascinating the rollout of that and the necessity to integrate with the old ways. One thing I'm curious about is which is always usually a theme in climate technologies. What is the financial value typically to store owners? How does this save the money, if anything? Could you talk about the ROI on the investment?
Yeah. So, without sort of saying specific numbers, which I can't share, but effectively, there's sort of three major categories of financial impact, and they tie really closely to the environmental impact that we're having, which is what sort of got me most excited when I joined Afresh, right? That perfect alignment of incentives. So the three major categories of impact we're having are one, we're reducing waste at the store. So if you're doing a better job at ordering and you're not ordering too much, right? You can now sell 100 bananas by ordering 105 instead of ordering 107. And that difference between the 107 and 105 is essentially found profit, right? It just flows through right to the bottom line, right? So that's the first category, reduced waste. Second category is you're also getting better at not under ordering, right? Sometimes you walk into a grocery store, right, and the shelves are just wiped, right? And you can't find the products you need, and you go somewhere else, right? And so that's lost revenue for the grocers. And so we're helping with that, again, trying to really at any given point maximize shelf capacity and making sure shelves are full, but the back rooms are empty so that nothing gets wasted and nothing got spoiled, right? So that's the second category. And then the third is really on the labor side, right? We're really not in the business of replacing labor. We're there to enhance labor. We think of the AI we're using sort of as a human in the loop AI, right? Really wanting to give store level employees a tool that makes them better at their job. What we're hearing anecdotally is that really increases job satisfaction for those folks, right? And helps with decreased turnover, folks just being more productive in their roles, right? and they're just spending less time doing this manual ordering task, and they can spend more time, restocking shelves, talking to customers, making sure the department looks really great in the store. And so it's just a much better experience for these store level employees rather than spending hours and hours every day, just writing an order with a pen on a piece of paper, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an interesting aspect. Obviously, being in the talent space, if you can retain people, you don't have to continue retraining them, and there's obviously costs associated with hiring and every time a new person. So even if it's not replacing talent per se, but helping retain it, can really allow the business to focus on other things. I do want to get into the waste aspect in 1 second, but one other thing I was curious about is on the AI side of things. How do you, and what are the kind of the key factors that you tend to use to help predict how much to order?
Yeah, so I'd say again, sort of, three major buckets, right? One is that data that I talked about earlier that we're integrating and receiving from the grocers, right? So that's, what are the items? How much have you sold of each item? At what price? Are any items going on promotion? Things like that, right? So that's the first category of data. The second is sort of data that we're gathering as people are using our app. So that includes things like where in the store is the item placed, how much space is allocated for the item, and so on. And then lastly, we do take into account some external data sources, right? So that could include things like the weather. Is there a holiday around? Some of our grocers are serving a lot of customers that shop with EBT food stamps, right? And so the beginning of the month is always a lot busier for them than the later periods of the month. And so we take that into account. So, three major categories, sort of internal data that we're receiving from the grocer, secondly, data that we're gathering through our app, and then external data sources.
Mm-hmm. And is it typical that as the AI is kind of developing, there will be a lot more predictions on trends within the kind of consumables based on regions in the US, for example?
Yeah, so we're forecasting really on a store and item specific level, right? So every store is super different. I've been to grocery stores in rural Montana, and I've been to some, here in San Francisco where I live, right? And obviously shopping behavior and items that sell and at what quantity and so on are very, very different, even if it's the exact same chain, right? That the store lives under. And so, again, we're not doing it regionally. We're not doing it, by state or anything. It's really by store, very specifically for every single item that the grocer carries.
Have you seen particular instances of these store managers being able to get access to this data and now kind of understand, hey, wow, perhaps I should maybe invest in some new products in this kind of area, or starting to be able to track it more? I'm assuming there are existing systems for this, but I'm just curious if you've had any particular instances where it was, kind of a eureka moment for them.
I'd say overall, the users are really sort of excited to have a solution that can help them with this because it is so complicated, right? And so complex. I don't think we've necessarily had folks being like, hey, like now I need to start carrying these new categories of items. We're not actually, that's not actually something we're optimizing currently, right? We're really optimizing quantities for items that they already carry, right? Or that the chain already carries, right? Sometimes, a warehouse will push out an item and we'll get some insight into, hey, actually this, this item that the store in San Francisco normally doesn't carry goes really well. And then we'll continue to make recommendations to order more of that. But it isn't necessarily optimizing around, the assortment of specific items.
Certainly. Okay. And then curious to go into the waste side of things. So do you have, maybe to take a step back a little bit, do you have any data on overall food waste in general, at least in the US, and then maybe in particular to understand what percentage of that is at the grocery level?
Yeah, so I think in the US, it's about 40% of food that's produced at the farm in the first place, right, that's being wasted throughout the supply chain. And then I think that roughly breaks down sort of 30% at the farm, 40-ish% at in the supply chain, so between distributors, transportation, and the retailers, and then 30% at the consumer level, right? So at homes. And so the biggest category is that distributors, transportation, and retailers. And so we're tackling that. And that was our initial entry point. There's obviously other players, right, in the ecosystem that are trying to deal with the waste issue and at different levels, right? I think that's awesome. It's super supplemental, right? And I think it's exactly what we need, right? As much as we can reduce at any given stage, that's fantastic.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'd be fascinating to see at some point potentially integrations with. I don't think this would become something that would come from the Afresh side, but perhaps help enable it at some point is integrations between companies like Imperfect, for example, on helping the store owners get rid of those final goods that are left. Right. I personally use Imperfect. Actually, it tends to be cheaper than actually going to the grocery store in New York.
Yeah.
But it would be interesting to see those levels start to work together to reduce the overall usage. I'm curious, do you have any average statistics on, or maybe just a kind of across your clients of what you've been able to affect and make an impact on this number so far?
Yeah, absolutely. So, with our existing grocers, we have, pretty good insight into how much we are reducing their waste. And it's about 25%, which is, I feel sort of incredibly proud of our team that that's the number, right? Because that's quite a lot, right? And, again, I think what excites me the most about this is sort of this perfect alignment of, we're reducing waste. That's amazing, and there's a lot of impact, and we can talk about some specific impact numbers from pounds of food waste reduced and what that means in terms of emissions or emission equivalents, right, and water and so on. But it also means the grocers are more profitable, and one of the effects that we have an hypothesis around, right, is that in the long run, because grocery is such a competitive industry that always tends to go back to sort of 1 to 3% margins, right? That means that grocers are able to maybe carry more fresh food in environments that they normally weren't able to do, right? Or that grocers are actually able to reduce their cost on those items, just making it more accessible to folks, especially in lower income communities, right? And that's actually something that, we have this hypothesis around. We sort of don't have exact proof points on this yet, but I pretty deeply believe that that'll happen in the long run, right?
Yeah, I think that is interesting to see. Obviously, there's this kind of fine line, I think, between just seeking profits and helping to create a more equitable world for various individuals in that space. So that is fascinating. I guess one thing I'm curious about is, as you're going through this process, obviously, these are probably long-term sales, right? These aren't just something you show up and you knock on the door and you sell it. But what is the general interest from store managers and from chains on this technology? Is it something there's a lot of resistance with, or are they pretty interested in usually from the beginning?
Yeah, overall, I'd say the feedback we're getting and what we're seeing in the market is super, super positive, right? I think there's a acute awareness that has really, I think, taken off in the last few years, 2 or 3 years, especially with the supply chain complexities that happened in the early days of the pandemic and obviously have sort of carried through it, right? And so more and more, it's really a relatively easy conversation that's like, there is this awareness that fresh specific software is something that grocers need to be successful in an increasingly competitive environment and an environment that's getting more and more complex.
Interesting. And I guess while there is a general interest, are there certain objections that you tend to face that you can, I like to talk about the objections because usually they're kind of fabricated in people's minds. I'm just kind of curious about that as well.
Yeah, totally. I think, something we relatively regularly hear, right, is that maybe they don't have the IT resources or they don't have the resources to implement a solution like that, right? And maybe they're going through sort of a ERP migration at the moment, or they're building, they're integrating some other technology. And so there's like sort of that, right place, right time moment, right? That you need to catch folks on. So that's definitely something we hear here and there. Generally, we believe that this is probably the highest impact initiative that a grocer can make, right? Because again, 25% waste reduction also means 25% cost reduction, right, for the grocers in their fresh departments. And that impact is just really huge on their bottom line, right? And so generally we're able to overcome that and up prioritize the Afresh rollout and integration, but sometimes we can't. And then I'd also say that some grocers are a little bit sort of scarred, right, from past experiences. I think there've been players in this space for a few decades, right, that have made similar promises or similar claims to what we've proved and what our grocers are experiencing, but weren't necessarily able to follow through on that, right? And so we're overcoming some of that hesitation of, yeah, maybe we were promised this in the past and people didn't deliver, right? And so there's a big trust element in the industry in general. And so we had to overcome that, especially in the early days. And I think now that we have more and more proof points, more and more case studies, more and more customers that are able to be references for us, it's getting a lot easier, right?
Well, one thing I'm curious, there's a couple of things here that have come to mind is you mentioned there's generally an interest in this technology for the fresh aspect, but do you tend to notice the understanding from grocers of the importance of the waste issue, the food waste issue? Is it something that's usually kind of already on the top of their mind?
Yeah, absolutely. I think grocers are really incredible in how much they're aware and they care about serving their communities, right? That's really how everyone from store level employees all the way up to C-level executives thinks, right? They are a big part of their local communities. And really, I think doesn't matter whether that's in a big city or in a rural community or anywhere in between, right? And so they're really acutely aware of the responsibility they have for their community and the broader world, right? So, waste is something that's on their mind all the time. A lot of the large grocers have actually committed to sort of net zero goals or at the very least reduction emissions, right? A lot of them have joined sort of alliances around that, especially on the waste side. And then there's also some, increasingly so and still very fragmented, but there's some regulation coming down the pipe on that as well, right? That, will encourage and incentivize grocers to divert waste that would otherwise go to landfills or to reduce their overall waste generally, right? So I'd say there's acute awareness generally, and then there's additional levers, right, both from a customer side, regulatory side, and so on, that makes them care even more over time.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to touch on that topic of regulation. So maybe could you talk a little bit more about where you're seeing this? Is it in particular states or is it on a federal level? What are the key things you're seeing? And generally, perhaps, what are your thoughts on the use of regulation in this particular space?
Yeah, so I think it's, and I need to confirm this, but I think it's mostly California that has sort of a very specific regulation target or waste reduction regulation target. I think that's a good thing as long as it is a realistic target, right? I think sometimes regulation comes in and sort of sweeps it and says, hey, you need to achieve 30% reduction in, and I'm making up numbers here, right? But 30% reduction in waste or 30% reduction in XYZ, right? In emissions or whatever impact it is. But it doesn't really show a path toward that, right? It doesn't create the environment in which that's actually possible. And I think that's really dangerous, right? Because that's going to cause a lot of frustration and essentially also makes penalties on, if you don't comply with the regulation really, really hard, right? Because are you going to penalize every single person in the space? Like that's really tough, right? And so I think regulation is most effective when it comes hand in hand with other incentives when it comes hand in hand with investments in the ecosystem that help, in our case, grocers, but really any company, right, achieve those regulatory targets, right?
Yeah, I do think it is interesting when regulation steps in, because oftentimes they might have experts who have kind of given them some ideas, but they're really just taking a stab in the dark. And I think my typical beef with regulatory action is that it needs to be flexible to iterate once they realize the effects of it, right? Because oftentimes there's negative side effects. But I
Totally,
do
yeah.
think in this kind of space it could be very interesting, especially given that the technology is already there, right? There's already technology to affect this change. One thing I'm always curious about, in this is particularly interesting in the real estate space, usually with going green effectively, if you want to call it that. Are there competitive advantages typically for your clients in being a more sustainably focused type of company?
Yeah, I think they are, right? Increasingly so, customers care more and more about this. And you'll see probably over the next few years, and this is already happening mostly with the really large public grocers, but I think it's going to happen more and more with grocers in general, that they do advertise that, right? We don't have a grocer yet, right, that goes out there and say, to customers, advertises, hey, we're using Afresh and that helps us reduce our waste by 25%. And I don't necessarily think that'll be the case, but I do think that going to a store, you'll see more and more how grocers are trying to advertise that they're have a wider range of organic products, for example, right, that they're offering. And that's sort of the first phase, right? I think more and more there's things like fridges where they're putting in things that are about to expire so that people can get it at a lower price, and that helps with waste reduction, right? And I think over time we'll see that they'll lean into that more and more, especially as customers like you and me care more about that, right? I don't, I have no idea how that will specifically play out. I think at the executive level, you see this again, sort of mostly by them joining these alliances and sort of sharing it more in that way, right?
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by it, because I think that if the trend continues as we're assuming it will, every industry that doesn't go green, for lack of a better term, all the brown industries or all the brown players in these industries that are going green will, maybe at the beginning it's okay, but they may be like, oh yeah, I'm still got business, but eventually they might just kind of be phased out, right? Because there will be the option to go to a more sustainable product. Obviously, there will always be kind of stragglers that still remain for various reasons. But one thing I really want to, because of your expertise in the space, I'm always curious to understand, in the industry as a whole, do you see any major kind of changes coming that in your mind you're maybe not sure of, but at least have a hunch of, that there might be massive paradigm shifts rather than just kind of small evolutions to kind of change? Where do you think anything is coming down the line that could really, really, really change things and how we even shop for groceries or whatnot?
Yeah, and in many ways, this is already underway, right? The adoption of sort of e-commerce in grocery was really slow pre-pandemic, and then took a massive acceleration, as people weren't able to go to grocery stores or didn't want to go to grocery stores, right? And I think a lot of that, maybe not all of it, but a lot of that is here to stay, right? I think there's some interesting visions that people have of what the future of a grocery store could look like, right? You could imagine something where the store itself is really mostly centered around fresh items, right? Because that's much more experiential, and people want to touch, the avocado before they buy it, or they want to see the strawberry before they purchase it, right? Or they want to pick a specific piece of salmon that they want, right? But it doesn't really matter as much for folks which Cheerio box, right? Or which, cereal box they pick, right? And so you could see a world where the sales floor is essentially almost all just fresh items. And then maybe you've made a pre-order of your boxed items, right? And it just meets you at the checkout, or even gets put into your car for you, or you just get that stuff delivered, right? Because that's so much more convenient and so easy, right? I think I don't see a world where we're sort of totally going away from brick and mortar retail, right? I think using Amazon again as like an example here, right? They just opened a grocer first down in LA, and now I think they already have sort of 40, 50 stores across the US that they're calling Fresh, right? That's the name of the chain. And that's just a traditional brick and mortar grocer. When Amazon made their first foray into this space, they really thought they could take it all online, right? And that just didn't work out, right? Then they bought Whole Foods, got a lot of knowledge, I think, what it means to operate a grocer, and are now sort of building this new chain in addition, right? So I think that's, again, I think brick and mortar grocer are here to stay, but I think the nature of brick and mortar could really change, right? That really enables people to have this very experiential experience, but not have to deal with all the annoying stuff of lifting cans of water or cans of Coke or whatever people are buying, right? And that just gets delivered to their home or gets put into their cars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is interesting. Obviously, it depends on you mentioned some people, want to have that experience of touching and feeling their fruits and things before they purchase them. I'm on the opposite, and I just want my groceries delivered, and I want to be done with it. But obviously, there's two different kinds of people, from rural versus urban areas, of course, right? So,
Totally.
one thing I maybe just want to touch on a little bit here is on the talent side of things. What does it look like potentially for you, for kind of the talent you're looking for? But let me just break this down. There's a couple questions here. So first of all, for Afresh, what are the key things that really matter to Afresh when they're looking for talent? Are there particular backgrounds or educational backgrounds that they're looking for? Or is this often come down to just kind of skill sets that can be trained as long as they have the right aptitudes?
Yeah, I think, look, we are a team of missionaries, right? That's, I think, the most important thing, right? Like every single Afreshie, as we're calling Afresh employees, really cares about the mission of what we're doing. And I think that's the sort of common denominator for all of us, right? And then beyond that, I'd say it's sort of really role specific, right? We're hiring across pretty much every single team, right? Engineering, product design, marketing, sales, like every single team is hiring. And I'd say it just depends, right? Generally, we want folks who are, high aptitude, are really motivated, we're still a relatively small company, so in the range of 170 or so people. And so we need folks who are willing to dig in and be proactive and get good work done. And at the same time, again, like really, really care about what we're doing, right? I think that's super important to us, and we made that a point from the very beginning. And I think that's what made the company successful so far, and I think it's what's going to make the company successful going forward.
Mm-hmm. And then on the on the second side of things, I'd be keen to understand what you're seeing for your clients, if you get into this at all, on their issues with hiring, because I know that there's a lot of these industries. I think in particular, I had somebody from Mighty Buildings in the past on talking about labor issues of skilled labor for building houses, for example. Is there a shift in making it's more difficult to find workers for these types of things in the grocery stores? And any kind of insights you might have there for what your clients are seeing and dealing with, just out of curiosity, and how your product might also assist them in that.
Yeah, definitely seeing some of that, right? Again, we're going through these different cycles, right? Sometimes harder, sometimes it's easier. I think at the moment, what we're hearing from our grocery partners is definitely that it's hard, right? It's hard to retain folks. It's hard to find new folks. It's hard to find folks that are super motivated, right? And want to do good work, right? And then to my earlier point, right? Hopefully we're making the folks that use our product, store level employees that use our products every single day, we're making their lives a little bit better, right? And a little bit more fun, and they can spend their times on higher value add tasks, right? And so we like really believe, and I've seen this live, right? Going to stores and seeing that, now they're only spending maybe an hour on the ordering side and can then spend time with the customers and, advising them and talking to them. And that's just a lot more fun for folks, right? And so there is, I think, really tangible benefit of our solution. And again, I think it's super hard for grocers at the moment to find the right talent and the amount of talent, right? And it's also super cyclical, right? You see that, in the sort of time leading up to Thanksgiving and the end of year holidays, right? The grocers hire a ton of folks, right? And that's sort of a little bit more seasonal and not necessarily the users that we have with our solution, but you do see that, and I think it's been really hard over the last few years for grocers to fill all the roles that they're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Well, one maybe final thing on this talent topic. I'm curious. I'm not sure if this is something you look at a lot or particularly interested in, but I'm curious about the climate tech space in general. With Are universities doing enough or doing the right things to actually get people really, really prepped for working in the climate tech space in many of these jobs? Like, we already know that within tech, generally speaking, a lot of people can just do a boot camp and start building their career kind of within 6 to 8 months. I'm curious to see if you have opinions on the university system in general, and perhaps the necessity of people spending an entire 4 years of their highly valuable time as young people with energy and ideas to go through university before getting into climate tech versus maybe either doing no school or doing 1 or 2 years or something like that. Just kind of curious on your general thoughts there, and if you see any trends or things that you're looking forward to at least.
Yeah, look, I think it's such an incredibly personal decision, right? I totally hear your perspective that, there's ways to get some, if not all, of the educational or purely technical education through other means, right? Whether that means working, self-learning, boot camps, whatever it is. I do think that going to university is more than like the pure, knowledge aspect, right? I think there's a lot to be said to maturing and being in an environment with people who want to learn and who are young and open-minded and want to exchange ideas and so on. And again, I think you can get this in different ways, but I'd say overall, I think there's a lot of value in going to a 4-year college and getting that type of education. And I'd also say that it's a super personal decision and it might not be the right path for everyone, right? So I don't have a super strong opinion there, sort of in general, other than that I don't think there's a one size fits all approach, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I certainly. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm just gonna say on the climate side, right? I think there's some universities, right, that are certainly investing in that. Obviously Stanford just opened the new School of Sustainability, right? I think that's awesome. I would love to see more schools have something like that, and in particular, maybe not have the schools that already have all the funding in the world and all the resources in the world, right? Start focusing on this more. And obviously Stanford falls into that category, and it's great that they're doubling down on efforts in that space, but they were already doing a lot before, right? I would love to see many more universities, and in particular the ones that don't have the biggest endowments, right? Shift focus and maybe see that opportunity, right? That there's so much capital and so much mind share, and increasingly so going into the space, right? And it's a great opportunity for new grads, right? To find a job that's maybe more meaningful, but also just pays well and is interesting and challenging, and they can learn it.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Obviously, with the kind of reduction in college applications, especially post COVID and everything, I think it will be interesting to see how people in the circles I'm in, because I'm somebody who did not go to university. I see it being it's really popping off for a lot of people who just don't necessarily see the value in going to another state college versus obviously Stanford or Harvard. Those kinds of places have really, really high rewards to them, but kind of an average school perhaps not. So I'd be keen to see how those schools, even though they tend to be relatively bureaucratic, might kind of adjust their path to become specialists in an area to differentiate themselves in more of a kind of business oriented way rather than academia type of way. Because
Yeah,
my
absolutely.
understanding is that it's currently kind of everybody trying to serve the same market and be kind of a one size fits all solution for everyone. But as a result, they're not differentiating themselves. So that's key. That's interesting to hear. But I guess I think that's everything. We've gone over a lot of great things. Are there any other final thoughts you'd like to leave the audience with, or other observations we didn't cover?
You know, I just think that I just want to again sort of share a little bit of my excitement of being in a role and being in a company, right, that means so much and does something positive to the world. I think that if you've not been in a company where you felt really connected to the mission or the impact that you're having, right, it's kind of hard to empathize with that. Um, I just wish that more and more people would do something that's really truly meaningful to them, right? And for me, that's climate. For you, that's climate, right? And it doesn't have to be climate for everyone, but I do think that is the defining sort of problem that we all need to solve, the defining problem of our generation and the generations to come, right? And there's obviously lots of other issues that we can tackle, and people that are the sort of worth people's time. But I do think that if we can convince more people to do stuff that's really meaningful and high impact, that would be awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't agree more. I think it is important to me, since it's such a time sensitive issue. It's usually why I bring up the topic around universities and that four critical years, that maybe could be two in most cases,
Yep.
or maybe one. But I do understand, like, there's obviously a lot of different pressures and things of that nature. But anyways, this has been a really great conversation. I really appreciate you coming on. I'm very excited to see what Afresh continues to do. If anybody listening is a grocer, please reach out to Johannes, and let's continue to advance the space.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Yep, you too.
All right, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. Please let us know what you thought of the show. We always appreciate any feedback. If you found something in particular that was interesting, always love to chat about it. You can reach me over Twitter. And then, of course, we ask you, please do share this with somebody who might find it interesting. I think in particular, there's probably a lot of us who may know smaller grocery stores, or perhaps some people who run a chain of grocery stores. Perhaps forward this to them, or at least forward the fresh information to them so they can check it out for themselves. You can reach out to Johannes over LinkedIn and learn more about Afresh there as well. And if you are joining us for the first time, please, of course, turn on notifications, subscribe, and leave a review if you enjoyed the show. A quick note for our next episode, we will be having, it is a conversation about carbon sequestration through forestry primarily, with Matt Smith from Finite Carbon. And I think the coolest piece of what they're doing is they're rolling out a program that allows anyone with as little as 40 acres to partake in the carbon market space. So really, it's very simple and extremely transparent, which I think is a big issue that typically faces the carbon markets and carbon credit space. So really interesting what they're doing. I think it was also very fascinating to me, especially being that I'm originally from the Northwoods of Wisconsin. So really excited to be able to drop this episode coming up soon. And thank you again for listening to CleanTechies the Podcast, and we will see you next time.